Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the United Nations, which has appealed for money, essentially, again, throwing money at the problem of refugees and, of course, for poor countries as well. There are a couple of levels of this appeal. One is for specifically funding towards the worst humanitarian crises in the world, in the world, and that can include, of course, Gaza, Myanmar, specifically possibly Bangladesh's Cox's Bazar, etc., Syria, South Sudan, Yemen. I mean, the list really is ongoing. And then the other is to help poor countries as well, and in dealing with the coronavirus pandemic more specifically. Now, the question remains, though, at this point in time, with many countries right now, at least, trying their best to try to control their internal situations when it comes to this pandemic, are we really going to see countries around the world give money to the UN, where they're trying to just control their own internal issues? Because a lot of these countries, let's be completely honest, are overwhelmed right now, even in the developed world. If they're not being able to handle their own situations, are they really going to spend funds, which they possibly would likely want to spend for their own citizens and for their own populace at this point in time, on, unfortunately, people who are largely unseen and unheard of around the world in many political leaders' eyes internationally? Let's discuss that further. We're now joined by Makram, Rabah, who is a lecturer at the Department of History at the American University of Beirut. He's joining us now from the Lebanese capital. Joining us from Birmingham is Marianna, who is a journalist and doctoral researcher at the University of Birmingham. And joining us from Valletta is David Nyheim, who is chairman of the International Conflict and Security Consulting. David, Marianna, and Makram, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Marianna, let me start with you. We've spoken about Greece with you in the past, of course, but we've had, of course, at this point in time, Greece being quite strong and stringent when it comes to trying to not shut down its camps, but like not take in more migrants at this point in time. Do you think that if there was to be an outbreak of coronavirus within those camps at this point in time, that would be cataclysmic for the country?
Oh, it would absolutely be cataclysmic, mostly for the people who live there and then for the country, because Greece doesn't have the capacity of dealing with the pandemic. It has been very clear through what we're seeing the past few days. There are barely any masks or even surgical alcohol at hospitals. The camps have there are no provisions for the camps apart from closing them down and not letting people out. People in Moria specifically have no water, they have no soap, they have no doctors. So I'm not sure what will happen, but I'm not sure what will happen exactly, but I do know that what will happen will be devastating for the people living there.
David, if we're completely honest, as I said in my introduction as well, a lot of these people who are in these camps or are asylum seekers at this point in time are, largely, to many of us, unfortunately, unseen and unheard of on an individual basis at the very least. Do you really think that countries will come together at this point in time to address the needs of these people, especially during this sort of a pandemic?
This is not a choice. This is a necessity. And very much along the line of what the Secretary General said, of the UN said yesterday, if we do not address the requirements and push forward on containment efforts in refugee and IDP camps, the pandemic will circle back and we will be hit again further down the line. So this is a pandemic that requires a comprehensive, long-term, coordinated effort, and this is an important point or an important element of whatever strategy we come up with at a global level to address the pandemic.
All right, so Makram, we know that the world needs to come together, work together, not just for refugees' sake and asylum seekers' sake, but just to be able to get over this pandemic to begin with. But if we're talking specifically about refugees and asylum seekers, of course, Lebanon hosts and has for many years hosted, for example, Palestinian refugees and even now Syrians as well, I believe. Do you think that a country like Lebanon needs the international help to be able to deal with now an extra issue on top of the fact that it's hosted so many, and to try to work out how to deal with this pandemic?
This is certainly the case. However, this international help will not go far as long as the Lebanese government does not acknowledge that it has refugees in Lebanon. It deals with this as if this is a problem that will go away on its own, and thus they don't have a long-term strategic vision nor a sustainable, transparent plan to answer the challenge of the refugees, be it the Syrian refugees, who over the last almost 9 years, there have been requests from the international community for Lebanon to field a clear roadmap to how to deal with this, and accordingly money will be dispensed. The problem is not the refugees, nor the coronavirus, I think. In many of the countries which are suffering from the corona epidemic now, or conflict in general, there's an intrinsic structural problem which needs to be addressed, and thus any future challenge, be it a pandemic or a future war, can be averted.
All right, so Marianna, let's talk more globally then. You're sitting there in the UK, and we know that the UK is having its own challenges right now dealing with the pandemic just within its own borders, convincing people to respect social distancing to begin with. I mean, there was that video coming out of the UK just recently about sunbathers out and police having to convince them, listen, go back home. This is not a holiday really at this point in time. But beyond that then, even the government level, there was first seemingly almost Trump-esque like denial on the part of Johnson about this pandemic. Do you think that a country like the UK, which does, technically help in other countries' affairs around the world and has done so for many years, do you think it even really has the ability to do so at this point?
Well, the government's response here in the UK has been below par since the very beginning. And it's pretty obvious that they don't really know what they're doing, and they're responding with random acts of imposing measures at the very last minute. So if they do this within the country, I don't think they will be able to respond globally, especially with the government that they have at the moment. That is a more isolationist government.
And do you think that the government at this point realizes what kind of danger it may be putting itself in right now and its own people if it doesn't work with the international community, even when it comes to, for example, as we're talking about asylum seekers, refugees, IDPs, etc.?
I don't think that they have realized the impact of this pandemic generally. And, for example, they are imposing measures within the UK, but they're completely ignoring the asylum seekers who live in the UK, the stateless people who live in the UK, and everyone that doesn't have papers in the UK, as well as the homeless populations. So the measures that they have been taking are for the middle and upper classes, and they're completely ignoring everyone else.
Okay, so then, David, at this point, let's talk about, I don't want to, become too fatalistic and alarmist, but this is certainly a very depressing situation, isn't it? Where it seems that the international community isn't working together in a fashion it should be, and isn't realizing the kind of threat that these sorts of camps, these refugee camps specifically, can pose to even really their own citizens, because they can become centers or hotspots of this virus spreading. What does that then bode for the next months?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think everyone is, in a sense, behind the curve on this one. However, I believe that there is an increasing realization that COVID-19 is a threat multiplier and is a phenomenon that requires multi-pronged, coordinated efforts. The international discourse at the moment on this is not promising. With the failure of the G7 to arrive at an agreement because of the politicization of, in a sense, the term, whether it's a Wuhan virus or a COVID-19 virus. But this is something that is going to unfold. The severity of it is going to be felt severely. And I am quite certain that as things unfold, with a rising death toll and a more clear understanding of how to address this and the shortfalls, that we will begin to see more investment in addressing it in areas that are marginalized or not receiving enough help at the moment.
Okay, so then, Makram, let's talk about this and the way that refugees in Lebanon, for example, live. Do you believe that if there were to be an outbreak there, how bad would that be? Not just within the camps or within the areas that these refugees live, but how bad would that be for just the average Lebanese?
Certainly, it would be catastrophic because the COVID-19 proved that there's no actual boundaries, be it international nor local. And this idea that a virus which, despite Trump keeps on calling it Chinese, even if it's charted in China, it can be a danger in Beirut or a danger in Washington, D.C. or anywhere else. Certainly, the problem or dealing with this coronavirus by telling people to quarantine and to stay home cannot be implemented on the refugees simply because they don't have homes. And these all instructional videos that tell us how to wash our hands, these people don't have running water nor indoor plumbing. And this is certainly the case because many of the countries, including Lebanon, has made it clear that the refugees are not welcome here. Some of the Gulf countries have been very aggressive in dealing with the coronavirus. And one of the main issues it started with that there's no such thing as native and a guest there. So all people who reside within the border should be treated as equal, specifically when it comes to healthcare and it comes to these services. So as I mentioned, any potential outbreak in these camps, and I think there are outbreaks in these camps, but they are not diagnosed yet. And the problem that there's no trust between the citizens and the government of Lebanon for them to give us actually transparent and accurate data. And this is the problem. This is where the problem starts. And I think what applies in Lebanon applies to a number of institutions that call themselves states, be it Syria or even Iraq or even Iran. We don't have this trust, which is very much needed, and this kind of unity between the people and the government to confront this existential threat, not only to the Lebanese, but also to humanity.
Okay, so then, Marianna, that brings me full circle back to nations. Is the UN right now well placed to convince any of the above countries, be it Greece, be it Lebanon, be it Syria, Iran, Iraq, whoever we may be discussing specifically, or even Bangladesh and Cox's Bazar, for example, do you think that the UN is well placed to convince any of the above to do the right thing, to treat these refugees/asylum seekers as really their own, considering the fact that this virus really doesn't know citizen versus refugee, etc.?
It's very well placed to convince countries, but I don't think, for example, if the Security Council does not intervene, for example, which is not its role in this specific case, I don't think that they will follow any directions from the UN because they have not been following directions from international organizations generally. The World Health Organization has been advising countries to start testing people for the coronavirus because isolation on its own does not work. However, they have been ignoring this. So I'm not sure. It always depends on the country and the abilities of the country, the economic abilities of the country. But I don't think that the UN will be able to force them to do something when it comes to refugees.
Then that I'll give you the final word then, David. Do you think the UN should have more teeth then when it comes to such an issue? I mean, the UN's very rarely had the sort of teeth it needs to ever enforce even past international laws on many issues of urgency. But in this specific case, do you think it should be given more teeth by the international community?
I think what we are looking at now are efforts to contain the pandemic. Where we are not at is understanding the threat multiplication impact of the pandemic. And I believe that is where the pandemic will soon be seen increasingly as a security issue, which may then require more forceful action from the Security Council. I believe the security implications that we will see from the pandemic include increased activities by insurgent and criminal groups in different countries as government attention is diverted. We will see more incidents of social unrest as populations respond and react to inadequate government handling of the crisis. And we will see the politicization of the pandemic in different countries and greater social incohesion and political tensions within countries. So this is, I think, what we have ahead of us, and what will probably drive the international response further down the line, and hopefully an international response that is more coherent and more forceful.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that. Appreciate David, Marianna, and Makram for their time today and for their insight from their respective vantage points. This is an important issue, and it's one that I believe at this point in time, at least the larger international community is missing out on. Credit to the UN for at least trying to address this. Whether or not countries will, as I put in my introduction, give money to this fund at this point in time to be able to help refugees, asylum seekers, or IDPs, internally displaced people, at this point in time, that's up in the air, because it seems that many individual countries on their own are having a hard time dealing just with an outbreak within their own citizenry, let alone anybody who is not a citizen and is seeking safety from persecution or otherwise from around the world. Nevertheless, those camps can very quickly become hotspots of a spread of coronavirus around the world, and can remain hotspots for a significant amount of time, because as Makram there described, just possibly when it comes to the Beirut or Lebanon camps of these refugees, there's no running water, there's not proper sanitation, and that's the same issue in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, for example, where Rohingya refugees are, or the same possibly even in Mexican camps, where you have Latin Americans seeking asylum in the U.S. and are now stuck in Mexico, for example, or even in the U.S. really. The conditions are not always very great in those camps where they are placed either, not very sanitized either. So this can potentially become quite a big headache, and countries would do best for themselves and their own citizens to deal with it ASAP. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Italy. Now, we know that Italy is one of the countries that has been most affected, at least at this moment, by the coronavirus pandemic. Numbers there are quite exponentially growing just on a daily basis. But one of the major factors that has come out as Italy has gone through this coronavirus pandemic is how the European Union has acted towards it. Now, Italy is, of course, an important member of the EU. Nevertheless, there are complaints in some quarters within Italy that the EU simply has not lived up to its reputation in trying to help a member state while it deals with this sort of pandemic vis-a-vis all sorts of help. We can talk about medical help or otherwise. There is now talk of the unleashing of €410 billion, bailout fund to help keep the country afloat. There's also talk about bonds of some sort, which might be called Corona bonds, from what I've understood, and otherwise. Yet it seems that it's in fact been other international powers beyond EU borders that have swooped in and have helped Italy in this time of crisis. We can list the likes of the Chinese and the Russians at this point in time, who have provided doctors and otherwise and equipment for Italy to be able to deal with the situation. Does that mean that the EU has failed? What does that mean about the EU as a bloc? Can it deal with such crises and help member states at the same time? Or will it just always be then about national interests of member states themselves? Let's discuss that further. I'm now joined by Antonio Scaramella, who is a geopolitical analyst. He's joining us from Rome. Also joining us from the Italian capital is Giuliano Bifolchi, who is an intelligence unit director at Austria Analytica. Giuliano and Antonio, thank you both for your time today. Antonio, let me start with you. How do you think that the EU is currently seen in Italians' minds? Do you think that there has been a bit of a stain now on its name because of the way it's acted during this pandemic?
Well, thank you for having me once again. First of all, one thing I would like to stress is the fact that, yes, there is some sort of stigma in a way. Yes, there has been a sign of what Europe actually did towards Italy, what they're trying to do, and on the other side, what they're doing somewhat against it. I'll try to be a little bit clearer. Well, on the central level, we have the Commission that says is willing to help. We have the issuing of Corona bonds, or, well, they're sort of Euro bonds. They just changed the name, so it's easier to accept the fact. However, we have seen that there is this lack of solidarity, not between the European institution and the single national state, but between the national states. And due to the fact that Europe was built as a house with its very foundation on solidarity and support between states, seeing that this situation, which is of course extraordinary. It's hopefully we will not have to witness it once again, but still, we are seeing that national egoism is on the rise once more, and solidarity has just disappeared. The fact that the face masks that were traveling through Czech Republic towards coming to Italy were stopped there by the Prime Minister Babic, just for in case we are going to need them. It's already a terrible sign. And the fact that the northern states, the northern countries in North Europe, were are still sort of against the Eurobonds, are not that much leaning towards more permissive economic policies, shows us that the solidarity here is what is missing. Because while, of course, on one hand, we have, the rules and regulations of the EU that needs to be upheld. That's for sure. I am a strong supporter of the EU, but this is an extraordinary circumstance. And in extraordinary circumstances, even the most hawkish defender of the 3% needs to reevaluate their priorities. We cannot have, now I'm talking a little bit, it's very generic what I'm saying, but we cannot have our grandparents die because the economics and the 3% needs to be respected. At a certain point, there is a human desire for life and a desire to protect life.
Okay, Antonio, I'm just going to come in just because I wanted to, if you allow me, I wanted Giuliano into the conversation as well. Giuliano, do you believe that the EU has failed in this case?
Well, thanks for having me, first of all. Secondly, I can tell you that if we look at how people like Italians, they perceive Europe, it's like they completely failed. But not only during this crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, but what happened also in the past regarding migrant crisis, regarding financial crisis in 2008, 2009. So many people, they feel negative sentiments and feelings regarding European Union. Also, they feel that European Union decide to abandon us, the Italian citizens, and they decide only to help all the EU members when other countries, such as France or Germany, had the same problem. So there is distrust regarding European Union. And also, of course, the European Union failed completely, not only failed regarding the strategy, but also regarding strategic communication. So the communication was so bad regarding the problem, and they allow other countries, such as China or Russia, to become the main actors and the main also partners in Italy. So the fact is that there are several mistakes regarding European Union. First of all, that they didn't perceive the problem, and they almost abandoned Italy at the beginning, and then the European Union, Brussels, tried to fix the problem, but without a good communication.
Okay, so Antonio, then at this point in time, kind of political ramifications will this have for Italy itself? Does this mean that, for example, those who are Eurosceptics in the future will have more power possibly in the country? Because, if we're talking honestly, we've already had the likes of Salvini who have, been in power at times, or at least been in influential powers in the country. Do you think that we will see the rise then of a more conservative right-wing leadership in the country in the future? What does that mean for Italy's stance then within the European Union bloc?
Well, I would not say that necessarily this coronavirus crisis will lead to more votes and more support coming towards Salvini. I say this for two reasons. First, he took his opposition role too seriously, let's say like this, in this moment of crisis, while criticizing the actions of a government, which is, of course, making mistakes because it's an exceptional situation, as I said before, but on the other hand, is not really winning that much of support. Going to the right wing on the other side, maybe, because Euroscepticism will be, of course, on the rise. And this is going to be, especially in the next years, if this trend is not inverted, very, very problematic, geopolitically speaking. Let's take a little bit of historical background first. After World War II ended, Italy needed to be encased inside NATO and inside Europe, inside the Western world. But on one side, half of the country was already pending towards Russia at the time, China then, with a very strong communist party. So what I'm actually trying to say here is that we could have not just a movement towards more Euroscepticism, but a movement away from Europe and the West as a whole. Because the West as a whole, we've seen has abandoned us, has left us alone. Because the US, which is supposed to be one of our greatest allies, did not support us anymore. We don't see the support in Europe that we were hoping for. And of course, when somebody else steps in and is showing willingness to help, they're putting up, they're sending us medical equipment. Cuba, for example, which is the socialist country for excellence right now, is sending us their physicians, their doctors to help us. So, of course, it's not to exclude that. It's not that we have a movement towards the right wing, but we could have a movement away from the West.
Okay. So then, pardon me, Giuliano, tell me then, what does that mean then for Italy in the future then, or even in the medium term? Because as Antonio there correctly mentioned as well, I'd forgotten to mention Cuba, but Cuba has also contributed quite a bit and tried to help Italy at this time of crisis. We can list the countries: Cuba, China, Russia have done their part in trying to help Italy at this time. Does that then mean that Italy will now seek to become more independent as far as its own policies, both within the country and even possibly foreign policies?
Of this new coalition government, the Italian Foreign Affairs Minister, Di Maio, said that Italy is a NATO member and follows the foreign policy of the European Union. But something changed for sure. First of all, China. China is becoming like a close partner of Italy, and probably we will be more involved in the Belt and Road Initiative. And as you know, Italy has this strategic position in the Mediterranean Sea, linked to the 21st Maritime Silk Road. So this means that, if you remember, in 2019, we signed a memorandum of understanding with China, and we can also improve this memorandum, extend it. Secondly, Russia is helping Italy. What this means? This means that Russia can also ask in June Italy to support, to be like a partner, to support like the abolition of the sanctions against Russia. So the fact is that, of course, all these helps is not for nothing, for sure. But this means that Italy can play a major role in geopolitics and can be more balanced. But we should also take into consideration that media, they are playing a major role in this emergency, in the coronavirus emergency. Why? Because, of course, there are many video and news on social media that are talking about how China, Russia, Cuba, Venezuela are helping us, of course. But there are less news regarding Germany that are taking some coronavirus patients from Italy, also some helps from the United States. What does it mean? This means that also Italy is not only affected by coronavirus, but by information warfare. And because geopolitics matters, and Italy is an important house in the Mediterranean Sea, and also is one that co-founded the European Union. So this means that if Italy shifts more to Russia, to China, this can change the balance also in the West.
All right. Antonio, I'll give you the final word before I let you go. Just tell us, what do you think the position of Italy will be going forward when it comes to the European Union bloc? Do you think that with these corona bonds, as you mentioned, that the EU has now finally acted in some way to help the country?
Well, of course, the situation here is going to be forever changing in the next months, and I'd say even next year, because everything depends on how the EU decides to actually act. Because we've seen a lot of words coming from the EU, we've seen a lot of words coming from Germany, coming from France, coming from the northern countries. But however, the actions is what is going to matter. Because, of course, Italy has its balance problems. That's clear and as clear as the sky. However, at this time of crisis, we'll have to the European Union will have to let go on pressuring Italy for a while and letting it recover from this crisis. If this happens in the ways that the Italian government deems adequate, this shift towards the east, let's say like this, could not happen. Otherwise, if this situation continues where more and more brakes are put on an action that needs to be done quickly, well, then the shape of the Mediterranean could radically change. Let's say like this, because I'm not saying that Italy leaves NATO. It's impossible to leave NATO. That's we have too many American bases and NATO bases in our territory. Yeah. However, the use that the government could allow the NATO alliance for these bases might not be as assured as it was before, and this could mean great strategic loss for the alliance.
Very well. I'll have to cut you off there, Antonio. I apologize. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us, but we appreciate both Antonio and Giuliano for their time. Viewers, we'll be back right after this break, continuing this discussion. And of course, as Antonio there mentioned at the end, there are now security implications too, right, for NATO and the West, now that China, Russia, and even Cuba have swooped in to help Italy at this time of crisis. I'll be back right after this break, continuing this conversation. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're continuing the discussion about Italy and how the EU has acted towards the country, its own member state, mind you, especially during this coronavirus pandemic, and how a lot of Italians at this point in time are feeling a bit hesitant about their place within the EU, possibly, especially as other countries outside of the bloc have swooped in and are helping the country. The likes of Cuba, China, Russia can, of course, be listed at this point in time. Let's continue the discussion. We're now joined by Michele Groppi, who is a current teaching fellow at the Defense Academy of the United Kingdom and challenges to the international order. He's joining us now from Verona. Joining us from Thailand, Trang, Thailand, that is Steve Keen, who is an honorary professor at University College London. Steve and Michele, thank you both for your time today. Michele, let me start with you. What do you make of how the EU has acted towards Italy during this pandemic? From the really early stages, there were complaints about the fact that the EU was not doing enough. Now there is talk of corona bonds, et cetera, but do you think that will be enough to sort of, revisit or to regain the trust that Italians may have once had in the EU?
First thing first, thank you so much for having me. And once again, it is a pleasure to see you. And thank you so much for addressing this topic, because for us, for a number of Italians, both in Italy and abroad, this is very important. To answer your question, unfortunately, this is very, very complicated. I personally feel that the EU has its heart in the right place, but the actions that Brussels is taking or wants to take, could definitely be improved, in the sense that we know here in Italy that as a continent, like as a union, we are facing a number of challenges, especially linked to coronavirus. France, Germany, Spain, even the Netherlands, they're all suffering, and they will be suffering with us, right? So we are definitely not requesting or we're not demanding important resources that could be used for German, Dutch, Spanish, and French citizens. So we are aware of that. At the same time, however, a number of Italians, including myself, right, and I am very supportive of the European Union in general, have been feeling puzzled, let's say, like to say the least, after a number of interviews, declarations, even, I have to be very honest, unfunny jokes, remarks by fellow European citizens, by leaders and all that. The narrative that goes here is that now they're leaving us alone, right? And I know, statistically speaking, I know that is not true, like empirically speaking, but that's how it feels. Right. Okay,
so let me bring in, if you allow me, Michele. Steve, do you think that the EU has failed in this regard? And then does this then go back to that argument that possibly Brexiteers would make, for example? And I don't want to connect two completely unrelated topics, but do you think that this sort of goes along the lines of what Brexiteers would say, where their EU is just sort of this bloc that isn't really prepared for these sorts of crises?
The whole function of the European Union has been to suppress government spending. It's been obsessed with the idea of small government. So you have the Maastricht Treaty limiting government debt to 60% of GDP, which is below the average America's achieved for the last 1.5 centuries. It's put a 3% ceiling on deficits, when again America's 120-year record shows that even living out world wars, the average deficit was 2.1% of GDP. It's all been about constraining spending, stopping the government doing things, cutting back on capacity. And this is now backfiring on the European Union because what it should have been doing is the exact opposite. It should have been building capacity.
So then, do you think, Steve, that these Corona bonds that the EU is now talking about, will that sort of help in this situation?
Well, I actually proposed Corona bonds myself about 2 or 3 weeks ago, saying that we simply had to use the capacity the state had to create money, to inject that money into the bank accounts of ordinary citizens and enable them to pay their rents and their mortgages and buy food and remain alive while not working. So that's the essential role they have. So I'm glad that they've finally made the same decision themselves. But the Corona bonds should have been, the idea of creating state money to make up for times when the private sector breaks down should have been fundamental to any major institution like the European Union. It's had to be pushed into it by a huge catastrophe. And of course now Italy is shortly about to overtake China with the most number of cases, of course, with a far smaller population. It just shows how badly this crisis has been mishandled by the Europeans.
Okay, so then, Michele, this has implications in many regards, right? Because the three countries that I laid out in my introduction who have currently helped Italy, at least, and that's been spoken about quite widely, is Cuba, China, and Russia, right? And none of the above really are very close friends of the West, if I may, group all these countries into that one category. What does that then mean for Italians going forward and their domestic / even foreign policies? Will we now see Italy in the near future or even long-term future moving away from EU foreign policies?
This is actually a very good question because there has been a lot of discussion surrounding this. Geopolitically speaking, let's be very clear. This is an opportunity for China and Russia, maybe less so Cuba, but definitely the two major powers to polish their image here in Italy, to enhance economic advancement, especially when we think about the Belt and Road Initiative. Let's not forget, it's supposed to arrive in Trieste. So the Chinese have a lot here at stake. That said, are we able to look at this in a not positive way? Absolutely not, because we need Chinese help. They have sent doctors, they have sent equipment, and so did the Russians. Therefore, this is a very valid point, because a lot of people, including major political parties, have been advocating this shift from Brussels, and especially France and Germany, who, unfortunately, and I'm very sad to say, right, because I'm a firm believer in the EU, but some leaders in those countries have not acted properly. The CDU has been helping some patients from Lombardy to actually to go to Germany. So it's not that, everybody is turning his or her back on us. That is not happening. I want to make that clear. However, the narrative, the huge impact, the psychological impact of the scene, Chinese flags in Rome, Russian military vehicles waving the Russian flags before entering Rome, this is huge. Right. So
indeed, let me bring in Steve on that, because Steve, I imagine that even on an economic level, right, where you have, again, as you said, the EU is quite protective of its own member states, but at this point in time now we've had China, Russia, and as I said, Cuba as well coming in and genuinely helping the country at this time. They will reap the benefits of that even economically, will they not?
I believe they will. I mean, of course, Cuba's been under a illegal boycott by America for the last 50 years. I'm no great fan of centrally planned systems. I've been to Cuba and I've seen the impact that a centralized system has on innovation in that country. But it certainly does provide a level of basic health care which far exceeds what Americans themselves enjoy, even though they have at least 10 times the per capita income. This is a very effective system at enabling an virtually instant response to public health threats like a pandemic. So Cuba, China, I hate to say it, but even North Korea will come through this crisis much more effectively than the West will do. And that's going to dramatically increase their political stakes and probably also break down some of the isolation the West has tried to push upon them when the times in the West were good. The times in the West are not good right now, and it shows that having an obsession about a totally market-driven system works when the economy with the world is going well, and can be catastrophic when you have a biological attack like this.
Indeed. So then, Michele, then are the defense implications here? Because Italy is a NATO member, is a member, as I said, of the European bloc as well. Are there implications there for it?
Again, like another very good question. Our Ministry of Defense and our Ministry of Interior had previously informed the U.S. about Russian and Chinese help. The U.S. now is also offering us, like in terms of defense, a few jets, a few helicopters to monitor the situation better over a few red areas, as we call them. The point being, however, Washington is aware of the fact that there are voices that advocate for a shift in defense as well, not just in economic terms, not just in cultural terms, not just in political terms, but also in defense terms. Will that happen? Major analysts here, such as Germano Dottori from Lewis University and other colleagues, argue that in the short term this will not happen, but in the long term, especially as the Chinese, generally speaking, or this is what we believe, right? So I mean, they're playing a much longer game potentially than maybe some EU or Western leaders, including maybe the Americans. Well, that's to be seen. So potentially there are defense implications. Intelligence sharing. Defense strategy in general, and most importantly, procurement. So,
yeah. Okay, so let me get the final word then from you, Steve, before we both go. What do you think really then are the implications for the West and for the rest of the world then? And I'm going to ask you this very macro question. Because of the coronavirus pandemic, it just seems like the Western world was just caught very off guard. I mean, to be fair, a lot of countries have been caught off guard because no one really plans for this level, possibly, of a pandemic. But it seems that the Western world, which has always touted itself as being very disciplined, organized, et cetera, planned out, has really been caught off guard. And that's sort of just showing in the chaotic scenarios that we're seeing playing out as far as policymaking goes.
Yes, well, the problem in the West is we've been dominated by conventional, what is known as neoclassical economics for the last 50 years. And that theory completely ignores the physical world. It simply presumes you have what's called blackboard economics. They write words like GDP, supply and demand, and labour on a blackboard. And they have no relation to the physical world at all. They completely ignore the biological side of the planet. And they've pushed efficiency all the time, saying, let's do what's more efficient, what's cheaper, trim the government back. That'll be the best way to go. That works when the global economy, when the global ecosystem is quiescent.
Yeah.
We have pushed that global system to the point of breakdown. And in this situation, the West is completely unprepared. It has built a totally fragile system dependent upon long supply chains, globalized production systems, and that is exactly what the coronavirus is smashing right now. And I believe this is only going to be the first of many, many crises.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that. But of course, we appreciate Steve and Michele for their time today and for their as we've tried to show you throughout this segment, viewers, when talking about Italy, it seems that the countries like Cuba, China, Russia have played the long game, as Michele had there alluded to as well. They've been smart. They've genuinely helped Italians at this time of crisis, where the EU did not step in time, where even the US didn't step in time. So traditional Italian allies did not live up to their stated friendship, quote unquote, or even really membership in the EU hasn't really benefited Italy in the ways that it possibly thought it would during such a pandemic and crisis throughout the country. So what does this mean then on the many levels that we've spelled out for you, be it defense, be it culture, be it the economy or otherwise? There will be benefits for all of the above countries. And how now will we see the geopolitical scenario changing for Italy and the rest of Europe and the Western world? We'll keep an eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.